1945. Europe burns under the shadow of destruction. The once mighty Third Reich stands on the brink of collapse. But to understand its fall, we must first understand how it rose. Germany 1919. The Great War has ended, but for the German people, the real pain is just beginning. The Treaty of Versailles has crushed their pride. Their economy lies in ruins, their army humiliated, their people starving. Out of this chaos, one man begins to rise, Adolf Hitler. Hitler, a failed artist and a bitter veteran, discovers the power of words. His fiery speeches promise hope, strength, and unity. In the beer halls of Munich, he tells the people what they desperately want to hear, that Germany can rise again. Slowly, his words ignite a movement, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. By 1933, the impossible happens. Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. With cunning political maneuvers and ruthless propaganda, he turns democracy into dictatorship. The swastika replaces the German flag. The Gestapo rises. Books are burned, voices silenced, and millions begin to fear the man they once adored. The dream of a thousand-year Reich begins to take shape. Massive rallies in Nuremberg show the world a discipline. United Nation, a machine built on loyalty and obedience. Hitler rebuilds the military, defies the Treaty of Versailles, and reawakens German pride. The world watches, some with awe, others with fear. But behind the grandeur, darkness brews. The persecution of Jews intensifies. Concentration camps begin to fill. The world remains silent, unaware of the storm about to engulf humanity. As the Nazi banners wave and the people cheer, Hitler looks out over his empire, convinced that destiny itself is on his side. But destiny has other plans. The seeds of destruction are already sown, and soon, the world will witness the rise and the fall of the Third Reich. Once in power, Hitler wasted no time. His vision of a pure and powerful Reich needed more than words. It needed control, absolute control. Germany 1933. The Nazi regime moves swiftly. Within months, opposition parties are banned, newspapers are censored, and dissenters vanish in the night. The Reichstag fire gives Hitler his perfect excuse. Germany is under threat, he declares, and with that fear, he seizes total authority. The enabling act turns democracy into dictatorship. The world watches, uncertain. Many see Germany as a rising power once again. Few realize that the nation's soul is being replaced by fear. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, floods every home, every classroom, every cinema reel. Radios play Hitler's speeches day and night. Children are taught that loyalty to the Führer is loyalty to Germany. The Hitler youth march through the streets, their eyes shining with blind devotion. Factories roar back to life. The unemployed find work, but under a system built on obedience. Every banner, every parade, every poster whispers the same message: one Reich, one people, one leader. But the illusion of unity hides a growing darkness. Jews are expelled from schools, businesses boycotted, and new laws mark them as outcasts. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped them of citizenship, turning neighbors into enemies. Fear becomes the law of the land. The Gestapo listens to whispers in every apartment, every cafe. People disappear overnight, their crime often nothing more than a careless word. The world begins to sense that something terrible is unfolding. But the League of Nations is weak, and Europe is weary of war. No one dares to confront the rising dictator. Inside Germany, Hitler's dream of conquest begins to take form. He orders the rearmament of the army, defying Versailles openly. New tanks, aircraft, and submarines roll out of secret factories. The Luftwaffe takes to the skies. Hitler looks east to Poland, to Russia, and west, toward France. He speaks of living space, of destiny, of empire. The crowd roars. The machinery of the Third Reich is ready. The world stands on the edge of an abyss, and soon, the first spark will ignite a war unlike any the world has ever known. By the late 1930s, Hitler's ambitions could no longer be contained. The world had given him silence, and he mistook it for strength. 1936. German troops march into the Rhineland, a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. France and Britain protest, but take no action. Hitler, emboldened, realizes the world will not stop him. It is his first great gamble, and it pays off. Soon after, he turns his eyes to Austria, the land of his birth. In March 1938, German troops cross the border without a shot fired. Crowds cheer in Vienna as the swastika rises above the city. The Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria, is complete. Europe trembles, but still does not act. Next comes Czechoslovakia. Hitler demands the Sudetenland, claiming it belongs to the German people. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, desperate to avoid another war, flies to Germany to negotiate. At Munich in 1938, Europe makes a fateful choice: appeasement. Chamberlain returns to London, declaring peace for our time. But peace is already dying. Within months, Hitler takes the rest of Czechoslovakia. His promises are empty, his hunger endless. Now, only Poland stands between him and total domination of Central Europe. Behind closed doors, Hitler signs a shocking pact with his greatest ideological enemy, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact secretly divides Eastern Europe between the two powers. The stage is set. September 1, 1939. At dawn, German planes roar over polished skies. Tanks roll across fields. Cities burn. The world wakes to the sound of war. Britain and France declare war on Germany. World War II has begun. Inside Germany, the people cheer once again. Propaganda calls it liberation. Soldiers believe they fight for glory. But in the smoke of burning cities, the truth begins to emerge. This is not a war for peace or pride. It is a war of conquest. In just weeks, Poland falls. The Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, stuns the world. Fast tanks, air raids, and total destruction. Hitler's strategy works like clockwork. Europe is terrified. The Führer smiles. The machine he built now devours nations. But as he celebrates victory, a shadow grows on the horizon. A shadow that will one day consume the Reich itself. The year is 1940. The Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, becomes Hitler's weapon of domination. It is fast, ruthless, and merciless. German forces move like thunder, tanks at the front, infantry close behind, and the skies filled with the roar of the Luftwaffe. In mere weeks, Poland is crushed. But Hitler is just beginning. In April 1940, Germany strikes north, invading Denmark and Norway. The attack is swift, coordinated, and devastating. By summer, both nations fall under Nazi control. The Allies are caught off guard, unable to match the speed and precision of the German war machine. Next, Hitler turns west. On May 10, 1940, his armies sweep through Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Behind them lies destruction. Ahead of them, the heart of France. British and French troops rush to stop the German advance, but it's too late. The Nazi army, using brilliant tactics from generals like Erwin Rommel and Gerd von Rundstedt, bypasses strong defenses through the Ardennes forest, a place no one expected an army could cross. Within days, German tanks encircle the Allies. By June, France is collapsing. German troops march triumphantly through Paris as the Eiffel Tower stands silent under the swastika flag. The world gasps. The once mighty French Empire has fallen in just 6 weeks. In London, Winston Churchill vows to fight on. He warns his people, the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Now, Hitler's attention shifts to the skies. The Luftwaffe launches massive air raids on Britain, targeting cities, factories, and civilians. The world watches as the skies above London burn during the Blitz. Night after night, bombs fall. Buildings crumble. Families take shelter underground as air raid sirens scream. Yet, Britain does not break. The Royal Air Force RAF, outnumbered but unyielding, fights back with courage and precision. In the summer of 1940, the skies belong not to Hitler, but to the defenders of freedom. Hitler's first great defeat has come. His lightning war had conquered Europe, but over Britain, the lightning fades. The Reich stands at its peak, and yet, within that triumph, the seeds of downfall begin to grow. Summer 1940. Hitler stands triumphant across most of Europe. France has fallen. Norway, Denmark, and the Low Countries are under his control. The swastika flies from the Atlantic to the edge of the Soviet border. Only one nation remains: Great Britain. To conquer the island, Hitler launches Operation Sea Lion, his plan to invade Britain. But before his troops can cross the English Channel, he must destroy the Royal Air Force, RAF. Thus begins one of the most legendary battles in history, the Battle of Britain. Day after day, the Luftwaffe attacks. Waves of bombers and fighters cross the channel, targeting airfields, radar stations, and cities. The roar of engines fills the sky, and explosions echo across London, Coventry, and Liverpool. But the British fight back. Young RAF pilots, many barely in their 20s, take to the air in Spitfires and Hurricanes. Outnumbered, but never outmatched in spirit, they defend their homeland with everything they have. The world watches as the sky becomes a battlefield. Smoke trails twist in the clouds, burning aircraft fall to earth, and across Britain, civilians endure the nightly terror of the Blitz. Yet, amidst the destruction, new kind of courage is born. People refuse to surrender. Underground stations become shelters, and the sound of bombs becomes part of daily life. Winston Churchill's voice echoes through radios across the nation. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight in the fields. We shall never surrender. Those words become a symbol of hope. By October 1940, Hitler realizes that Britain will not fall. The RAF, through sheer determination and tactical brilliance, has broken the Luftwaffe's momentum. German losses are heavy. Hitler postpones the invasion indefinitely, his first major defeat. For the first time, the myth of Nazi invincibility begins to crack. The British have proven that courage and conviction can stand against tyranny. But while the world celebrates, Hitler's mind turns eastward. There, beyond the horizon, lies the Soviet Union, a land vast and rich, a target that will change the course of history forever. The skies of Britain may be safe, but Europe's darkest storm is only beginning. Having failed to bring Britain to its knees, Hitler now turns his gaze to the east, toward the vast lands of the Soviet Union. It will become the greatest invasion in history, and the beginning of his own destruction. June 22, 1941. Before dawn, the silence along the eastern border shatters. 3 million German soldiers, the largest invasion force ever assembled, cross into Soviet territory. Tanks roar, artillery thunders, and planes darken the sky. The Wehrmacht strikes with the same lightning speed that conquered Europe. Hitler calls it Operation Barbarossa, his crusade against communism, and a war for living space. But behind his rhetoric lies something deeper: hatred, ideology, and a hunger for total domination. The Soviet Union is taken by surprise. In the first weeks, entire armies collapse. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers are captured. The cities of Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev fall in rapid succession. German officers believe victory is within reach. By autumn, the Nazi army stands at the gates of Leningrad in the north, Stalingrad in the south, and Moscow in the center. The world watches in awe. Can anyone stop Hitler's war machine? But then, nature itself begins to fight back. The Russian winter arrives, brutal, merciless, and unrelenting. German tanks freeze in the snow. Engines fail. Soldiers, dressed for summer, shiver and die in the icy winds. The Soviet resistance hardens. Civilians dig trenches, women and children build barricades, and soldiers fight to the last bullet. The spirit of the Russian people refuses to break. In December 1941, as the temperature plummets to 30 C, the Red Army launches a massive counterattack. The Germans are pushed back from Moscow for the first time. At the same time, far away in the Pacific, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. The United States enters the war. The conflict that began in Europe has now become a world war in every sense. Hitler had believed that Russia would fall in weeks. Instead, he has opened a front so vast, so deadly, that it will swallow millions. The myth of the invincible Reich begins to fracture. Snow covers the bodies of fallen soldiers. The roads that once led to conquest now lead only to ruin. And in the frozen silence of the Eastern Front, the Third Reich begins to bleed. It was not just a battle, it was a test of human endurance, of will, and of the soul itself. September 8, 1941. German and Finnish forces encircle Leningrad, the cradle of the Russian Revolution, and a symbol of Soviet pride. Hitler issues a cruel order. Leningrad must be erased from the map. Thus begins one of the longest and most brutal sieges in human history. The Siege of Leningrad. The city, home to more than 2 million people, is cut off completely. No food, no fuel, no escape. The German army surrounds it from land. The Luftwaffe bombs it from above. The plan is not to conquer, but to starve it to death. Winter descends early. Temperatures drop below freezing. The once grand city becomes a wasteland of hunger and despair. People burn furniture to stay warm. Bread rations shrink to almost nothing. Even glue and wallpaper paste are eaten for survival. In the streets, bodies lie frozen, silent reminders of the city's suffering. Yet, amid the horror, Leningrad refuses to surrender. The people endure. Musicians play symphonies in bombed-out halls. Teachers hold classes in basements. The human spirit refuses to die. The only lifeline is the road of life, a narrow, dangerous supply route that crosses the frozen Lake Ladoga. Trucks carry food and supplies across thin ice under constant shell fire. Many never make it, but those who do keep the city alive. For 872 days, Leningrad holds out. More than 1 million civilians perish from hunger, cold, and bombs, yet the city never falls. When the siege is finally lifted in January 1944, Leningrad stands in ruins but unbroken. Its defenders and citizens have endured the unimaginable. The failure to capture Leningrad marks another turning point for Hitler. His armies are stretched thin, his resources draining, and his aura of invincibility fading. While Germany celebrates small victories elsewhere, the Eastern Front becomes a slow, bleeding nightmare, one that will eventually swallow the Reich whole. In the ashes of Leningrad, one truth stands eternal. The will of a free people cannot be starved, it cannot be frozen, and it will never bow to tyranny. In the ruins of one city, the fate of the entire world was decided. Stalingrad, where the dreams of Hitler's empire turned to dust. Summer, 1942. Despite the brutal winter and heavy losses, Hitler orders a new offensive. His eyes turn south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, and toward a city bearing the name of his enemy, Stalingrad. It is more than a strategic target. It is personal. To Hitler, capturing Stalingrad means humiliating Joseph Stalin. To Stalin, losing it is unthinkable. The stage is set for one of the bloodiest battles in history. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe begins its assault. Thousands of bombs rain down, reducing the city to rubble. Streets vanish under clouds of dust and flame. Civilians are trapped in the inferno. Yet, the Soviet defenders refuse to abandon their city. House by house, street by street, floor by floor, the fighting becomes a nightmare of close combat. Factories become fortresses. Snipers hide among ruins. Entire battalions are wiped out for a single building. The Volga River, once a lifeline, turns red with blood. German forces push deeper into the city. Hitler declares victory prematurely, convinced that Stalingrad will soon fall. But Stalin's orders are clear: not one step back. Fresh Soviet divisions pour across the Volga under relentless fire. The defenders fight with unimaginable courage, sometimes with only a single rifle for 2 men. Then, in November 1942, the tide turns. The Red Army launches Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive. Soviet forces encircle the entire German Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, trapping them inside Stalingrad. Winter strikes again. Temperatures plummet, supplies vanish, and starvation spreads. Hitler forbids retreat. He orders General Friedrich Paulus to hold the city to the last man. But the last man cannot hold forever. By February 1943, the once proud German army is broken. Paulus surrenders, the first German field marshal ever to do so. Of the 300,000 who entered Stalingrad, less than 90,000 remain alive, and only a few thousand will ever see home again. The Battle of Stalingrad becomes the turning point of World War II. The unstoppable Reich has been stopped. The myth of Nazi invincibility dies in the frozen streets of Stalingrad. From this moment onward, Hitler's armies will retreat step by step, city by city, until the Reich itself falls into the ruins it created. Stalingrad changed everything. The hunter had become the hunted, and the once mighty Reich began its long retreat into oblivion. 1943. The snow of Stalingrad is soaked with the blood of an empire. Hitler's greatest army lies shattered. Across Europe, the illusion of Nazi invincibility begins to fade. The world senses a shift, a turning tide. In the east, the Red Army surges forward with renewed strength. Soviet factories, moved deep into the Urals, now pour out tanks, guns, and planes in astonishing numbers. For every German tank destroyed, 10 more Soviet machines roll toward the front. The Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, erupts in July 1943. Over 6,000 tanks clash across the fields of Russia. The air fills with smoke and fire, metal grinding against metal. Hitler's last great offensive in the east fails miserably. From this point on, the German army will never again take the initiative. Meanwhile, in the west, the Allies grow stronger. In North Africa, British and American forces crush Hitler's desert ambitions. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, is forced to retreat as the Allies capture Tunisia in May 1943. Soon, Allied troops invade Sicily, then Italy itself. Mussolini's fascist regime collapses. The Italian people rise up against him, and the Deuce is arrested. Hitler rushes to save his ally, sending German paratroopers to rescue Mussolini and occupy northern Italy. But it's too late. The Axis alliance is breaking apart. Inside Germany, whispers begin to spread. For the first time, officers and civilians question the Führer's leadership. Food grows scarce. Bombs fall from Allied planes day and night. Cities like Hamburg and Cologne are reduced to ashes. Yet, Hitler refuses to see the truth. He blames his generals, demands more sacrifices, and dreams of weapons that will turn the tide again. But deep down, even his closest men begin to see the war is lost. In the east, Soviet forces advance relentlessly. In the west, American and British bombers darken the skies. The Reich that once stretched across Europe is shrinking, bleeding, and breaking. For Hitler, Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was the beginning of the end. And though millions will still die before the guns fall silent, the path to the fall of the Third Reich has now begun. As Hitler's dream begins to crumble in the east, a new storm gathers in the west. The free world prepares to strike back. By 1944, the balance of power has shifted. The Allies, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union stand united in purpose. Germany's armies are stretched thin, fighting brutal battles on two fronts. The once mighty Reich is being crushed by the weight of its own ambition. The air war intensifies. Allied bombers sweep across Europe, reducing German cities to rubble. The factories that once fed Hitler's war machine now burn beneath a rain of fire. Every night, the skies over Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden glow with flames. Civilians take shelter underground as entire neighborhoods vanish. But destruction from the air is only the beginning. The Allies are preparing for the greatest invasion in human history, Operation Overlord. The assault on Nazi-occupied France. In secret camps across England, hundreds of thousands of soldiers gather. American, British, and Canadian forces train side by side. General Dwight D. Eisenhower leads the operation. Every plan, every code, every heartbeat counts down to one single day. June 6, 1944. D-Day. At dawn, thousands of landing craft cross the English Channel. The beaches of Normandy erupt in fire and chaos. The sea turns red as Allied troops storm ashore under heavy German fire. Machine guns roar from bunkers. Artillery shakes the ground, but still, they advance. On the sands of Omaha, Juneau, Gold, Utah, and Sword, courage outweighs fear. By nightfall, the Allies have secured a foothold in France. The wall of Fortress Europe has been breached. From that day forward, the tide of war surges toward Germany. French resistance fighters rise. Towns are liberated one by one. The world begins to believe that victory, long distant and uncertain, is finally within reach. In Berlin, Hitler rages in his bunker, refusing to accept reality. He orders new offensives, new armies, new miracles. But his empire is collapsing faster than he can rebuild it. The Western Allies push from France. The Soviets push from the east. The Reich, once feared and unbreakable, is now trapped between two unstoppable forces. The end is coming, and even Hitler can no longer deny it. The thunder of war that once began with his rise now echoes toward his fall. The beaches of Normandy had been won, but victory in France would not come easily. The road to liberation was long, bloody, and paved with sacrifice. After D-Day, the Allies began their push inland. The hedgerows of Normandy became deadly traps, narrow lanes, surrounded by thick earth and tangled brush, where German snipers waited silently. Every field, every village had to be fought for. The cost was measured not in miles, but in lives. General Omar Bradley's First Army pushed from the west, while British and Canadian troops advanced from the north. The Germans fought fiercely, commanded by experienced officers like Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Yet even Rommel could see what others could not admit. Germany's defeat was now inevitable. In late July 1944, the Allies launched Operation Cobra. A massive carpet bombing shattered German defenses, opening the path to breakout. Within days, Allied tanks roared through the countryside, cutting off retreating Nazi forces. The German front collapsed in chaos. By August, the Allies reached Paris. For 4 long years, the French capital had lived under the iron grip of Nazi occupation. The people waited fearful, yet hopeful. Now, the sound of gunfire echoed through the streets once more, but this time it was the sound of freedom. The French resistance, long hidden in the shadows, rose in open revolt. Barricades appeared overnight. German patrols clashed with French fighters in narrow alleys. The world watched as the city that symbolized European culture became the battleground for its own liberation. On August 25, 1944, tanks of the French 2nd Armored Division, led by General Philippe Leclerc, rolled into the heart of Paris. Crowds flooded the streets, waving flags, cheering, weeping. The bells of Notre Dame Cathedral rang out for the first time in years, not in mourning, but in triumph. General Charles de Gaulle, the exiled leader of Free France, returned to his homeland, walking proudly down the Champs-Élysées amid thunderous applause. For the people of France, this was not just liberation, it was rebirth. But even in celebration, the war was far from over. Beyond the borders, Germany still fought with desperate fury. Hitler ordered counterattacks, determined to make Europe bleed for every inch of lost ground. Yet the truth was clear. The Allies had torn open the western gates of the Reich. Every mile forward brought them closer to Berlin, and to the final reckoning of the Nazi regime. France was free once more, but the shadow of war still stretched eastward, where the fate of the Third Reich awaited its fall. With France liberated, the Allies turned their eyes east. The road to Berlin stretched before them, journey through fire, blood, and steel. The summer of 1944 had turned the tide of war. From the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Paris, the Allies had reclaimed Western Europe. Now, their mission was clear: invade the heart of the Nazi Empire. But Hitler refused to surrender. From his bunker in Berlin, he demanded total war. Every man, woman, and child was to fight. The German army dug in, preparing to defend every inch of ground. As the Allies advanced, the resistance grew stronger. The once glorious Wehrmacht was wounded, but not dead. It fought with desperate fury, using every trick and weapon left. The cities of Aachen, Metz, and Nancy became strongholds of defiance. The Allies faced bitter combat through bombed villages, shattered forests, and endless rain. Mud clogged the tanks, aircraft grounded in storms, and every river crossing became a deadly trap. In the east, the Red Army pressed forward with relentless momentum. The Soviets liberated Warsaw, crossed the Vistula River, and prepared for their final push toward Berlin. Two massive forces, one from the west, one from the east, were closing in like a tightening noose. By September 1944, the Allies reached the borders of Germany itself. Hitler ordered the construction of defensive lines, the Siegfried Line, a chain of bunkers, minefields, and barbed wire stretching across the western frontier. Behind those walls, Germany's last defenders prepared for battle. Meanwhile, the Allied High Command launched a daring plan, Operation Market Garden, to cross the Rhine River and end the war before Christmas. Thousands of paratroopers descended behind enemy lines in the Netherlands, capturing key bridges. For a brief moment, it seemed success was within reach, but the operation faltered. At Arnhem, German panzer divisions counterattacked with brutal precision. The paratroopers fought valiantly, but were overwhelmed. The dream of ending the war quickly died in smoke and blood. Winter descended upon Europe once again. The soldiers dug into frozen trenches, exhausted, yet unbroken. The end of the war felt close, but not close enough. Inside Berlin, Hitler clung to delusion. He spoke of secret weapons, the V2 rockets, the jet fighters, and the miracle that would save the Reich. But deep down, even his generals knew. The Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own madness. The Allies now stood at Germany's gates. Ahead lay the final battles, fierce, unrelenting, and unforgettable. Just when victory seemed within reach, the dying Reich struck back with one final, desperate gamble. December 1944. Winter blanketed Europe in ice and silence. The Allied forces, weary from months of battle, believed the Germans were finished. But deep within the forests of the Ardennes, Hitler planned a counterattack that would shake the world. He called it Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. His goal, to split the Allied armies, capture the Belgian port of Antwerp, and force a peace on German terms. It was madness, but also his last chance to turn the tide. Before dawn on December 16th, the quiet woods exploded with artillery fire. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, supported by tanks and armored vehicles, surged through the snow. Caught completely off guard, the American front line shattered. Villages like Bastogne, St. Vith, and Malmedy became the center of chaos. Snow mixed with smoke and blood as retreating troops fought to hold the line. For days, confusion ruled the battlefield. Radios jammed, orders lost, and skies too clouded for Allied air support. The German offensive created a massive bulge in the Allied front, giving the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. It was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II. Amid the chaos, one name became legend: Bastogne. Surrounded by German forces, the 101st Airborne Division, under General Anthony McAuliffe, refused to surrender. When the Germans demanded his surrender, McAuliffe simply replied with one word: nuts. That single defiant answer symbolized the spirit of the Allies. Surrounded but unbroken. Then, on December 23rd, the skies cleared. Allied aircraft roared back into action, pounding German convoys from above. Patton's Third Army, moving with impossible speed through the snow, broke through to relieve Bastogne. By January 1945, the German offensive had failed. The cost was staggering: nearly 100,000 German casualties and the loss of irreplaceable tanks, men, and hope. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's final gamble, and it had cost him everything. From that moment on, the Third Reich would never again go on the offensive. The Allies began their final march toward the heart of Germany. The snow of the Ardennes ran red with blood. In that frozen silence, the fate of Nazi Germany was sealed. The last German gamble had failed. The snow melted, and with it, the final hopes of the Third Reich. By the start of 1945, the Western Allies stood once again on the borders of Germany. The once proud Wehrmacht was shattered, its armies exhausted, its fuel nearly gone, and its soldiers fighting only for survival. The aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge left the German war machine crippled. Thousands of tanks and trucks lay buried under snow, wrecked by airstrikes or abandoned in retreat. Hitler's dream of dividing the Allies had turned into another nightmare of defeat. As winter faded, the Allies prepared for their final push across the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier before Berlin. But the river was heavily fortified. Every bridge was mined, every crossing defended. Then, in March 1945, something miraculous happened. At the town of Remagen, American troops discovered the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. Despite German orders to destroy it, the charges failed to detonate properly. Without hesitation, American forces stormed the bridge under fire, capturing it intact. Across that single span of steel and smoke, the Allies poured into Germany. For the German soldiers, morale collapsed. For the civilians, terror began. The skies belonged to the Allies now. Thousands of bombers roared overhead day and night. Cities like Cologne, Frankfurt, and Dresden were reduced to ashes. The once proud industrial heart of Germany became a wasteland of fire and rubble. Refugees flooded the roads, women, children, and old men fleeing from both west and east. Behind them, the sound of war grew louder, closer, endless. The Allied soldiers, though victorious, were not untouched by what they saw. Entire towns destroyed, homes burned to the ground, families shattered. The war that had begun as a mission of liberation had now become a march through ruins. In the east, the Soviet army crossed the Oder River, only 60 kilometers from Berlin. Between the two fronts, Hitler's empire shrank into a dying shadow. Inside his bunker, the Führer raged against reality. He issued impossible orders, dismissed generals, and trusted only the fantasy of final victory. But his empire was crumbling faster than ever before. By April 1945, the Allies had surrounded the heart of Germany from all directions. The Third Reich, once promised to last 1,000 years, was now living its final days. The bridges had been crossed, the cities had fallen, and the walls of the Reich were closing in. The end was no longer a question of if, but when. From the frozen plains of the east came the final storm, the Red Army, roaring toward Berlin like a tide of vengeance. While the Allies advanced from the west, the Soviet Union unleashed its greatest offensive from the east. After years of brutal suffering, Stalingrad, Leningrad, coursed the Red Army was determined to crush the Reich once and for all. By January 1945, Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konov commanded millions of Soviet soldiers. Their artillery thundered across the Vistula River, shattering German lines that had once seemed impenetrable. The cities of Warsaw and Krakow were liberated, but what they found was horror. Entire populations murdered, towns reduced to ash. As the Soviets marched west, vengeance burned in their hearts. The memory of Nazi atrocities, the villages burned. The millions starved or executed fueled their fury. Now, they would bring the war home to Germany itself. In February, the Vistula-Oder offensive began, one of the most massive attacks in history. Thousands of tanks and artillery pieces fired in unison, turning the front line into a wall of fire. German defenses collapsed almost instantly. Within weeks, the Red Army had advanced more than 400 kilometers, reaching the Oder River, the final barrier before Berlin. German cities like Niggsburg, Breslau, and Danzig were surrounded and destroyed. The once invincible Wehrmacht was reduced to scattered pockets of resistance, led by boys too young and men too old to fight. Inside Germany, chaos reigned. Refugees fled westward in endless columns, hoping to escape Soviet retribution. But the Red Army's advance was unstoppable. For every town captured, another German unit fell apart. Another division vanished into the snow. Hitler's response was madness. He forbade retreats, executed officers who disobeyed, and still promised miracles that would never come. His generals knew the truth. The war was lost, but none dared to speak it aloud. By April 1945, Soviet artillery could already be heard in Berlin. The city that once symbolized Hitler's power was now surrounded by flames and fear. In the bunkers beneath the Reich Chancellery, the Führer ranted to his remaining followers. Maps covered with imaginary armies lay on his table. Outside, the real armies, the Red Army, were only days away. For the people of Germany, the end had come. For the people of the world, justice was marching to Berlin. April 1945, the thunder of Soviet guns echoed through the streets of Berlin. The final chapter of the Third Reich had begun. Berlin, once the shining capital of Hitler's empire, was now a city of ruins. The once grand avenues were buried beneath rubble. The air was thick with smoke and dust. Civilians huddled in basements as shells rained down day and night. The Soviet artillery fired without pause, thousands of guns surrounding the city, pounding it from every direction. Marshal Zhukov's first Belarusian front attacked from the north, while Marshal Konev's first Ukrainian front pushed from the south. Between them stood what remained of the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Volkssturmboys, old men and broken soldiers who fought with fanatical desperation. Inside his bunker, Adolf Hitler refused to surrender. He still dreamed of counterattacks that no longer existed, of divisions that were only names on paper. He moved imaginary armies on his maps while outside. Real Soviet troops were only a few kilometers away. Berlin became a living hell. Every street turned into a battlefield. Soviet tanks rolled over barricades of furniture and debris. German soldiers fought from windows, basements, and subway tunnels. The once proud German capital had become a tomb. Amid the chaos, civilians tried to survive, carrying water through the ruins, tending to the wounded, searching for lost children. Many had believed in Hitler's promises. Now, they faced the cost of those lies. On April 20, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, the Soviets began their full assault on the city. The bombardment was so intense that even hardened soldiers wept at the sight. For days, the Red Army fought block by block, house by house, room by room. In the skies above, Soviet aircraft bombed whatever was left standing. The smell of fire, smoke, and death filled the air. By April 25th, Berlin was completely encircled. There would be no escape, no reinforcements, only the end. Hitler's closest allies Goebbels, Himmler, Bormann argued and plotted in the bunker. Some still believed in a miracle. Others secretly planned their own survival. But deep down, they all knew the Third Reich was finished. The Soviets raised their red banners higher with every passing hour. And as the streets burned, the sound of victory drew closer. In the heart of the city where it all began, the fire that had consumed the world was now consuming itself. Berlin was dying, and with it, the Reich. Above the ground, Berlin was burning. Below it, in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, the final days of Adolf Hitler unfolded in madness and despair. Deep beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, hidden behind thick concrete walls, lay the Führerbunker, a dim, airless labyrinth of rooms filled with smoke, fear, and hopeless whispers. Here, the leaders of the dying Reich lived their final hours, cut off from the world above. Outside, the Red Army was closing in. The sound of artillery was constant, a deep, shaking roar that reminded everyone the end was near. But inside, Hitler refused to face reality. He spent his days studying maps that no longer mattered, giving orders to divisions that no longer existed. His generals Keitel, Jodl, and Krebs stood in silence as he raged and screamed. He blamed everyone, the German people, his officers, even the weather, but never himself. Beside him was Eva Braun, loyal until the end. She had joined him in the bunker weeks earlier, smiling and dancing to gramophone records as the world collapsed above her. Their love story, once hidden, would end in that underground tomb. Others filled the bunker too: Joseph Goebbels, his wife Magda, and their 6 children, secretaries, guards, doctors, and messengers. Each of them clung to denial, hoping for a miracle that would never come. As the Soviets advanced, the noise grew louder, every explosion a reminder that time was running out. On April 28, 1945, news reached Hitler that his ally Mussolini had been captured and executed by Italian partisans. His body hung in a public square. Hitler saw his own fate in that image and decided he would not share it. On April 29, he dictated his last will and political testament. He appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor and married Eva Braun in a quiet ceremony inside the bunker. The next morning, April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops fought only a few hundred meters away, Hitler and Eva retreated to their private room. Moments later, gunshot echoed through the halls. The man who had set the world on fire was dead. His body was carried outside, doused in petrol, and burned in the garden above. The empire he promised to last 1,000 years had fallen in 12. Those who remained in the bunker wept in silence, not from sorrow, but from exhaustion. Above them, the Red Army raised the Soviet flag over the ruins of Berlin. The tyrant was gone, but the pain he caused would scar the world forever. The bunker was silent now, the echo of a fallen empire. The Führer was dead. but above the ashes of Berlin, the war still raged on. The final death of the Third Reich had yet to come. When word spread that Adolf Hitler was gone, silence fell over the bunker and across what remained of Nazi Germany. Some refused to believe it. Others broke down in tears, not from grief, but from the sudden realization that everything was truly over. In the days that followed, confusion ruled the collapsing empire. Joseph Goebbels, now chancellor by Hitler's will, made one final broadcast to the German people, promising that the Reich would rise again. Hours later, he and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 children, then took their own lives in the garden above. Their dream of a pure world had turned to dust. Meanwhile, Soviet forces swept through Berlin. The once mighty German capital was now an ocean of rubble. Buildings lay in heaps, streets were filled with corpses, and the stench of death lingered everywhere. For many civilians, survival became the only goal. The Reichstag, symbol of German power, was captured by Soviet troops on May 2, 1945. As the red flag was raised over its ruins, gunfire still echoed in the distance, the sound of the last defenders dying in vain. Farther west, German generals struggled to maintain order. With Hitler gone, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, based in the town of Flensburg, tried to form a new government. He hoped to negotiate a surrender to the Western Allies, fearing Soviet occupation above all. But there would be no negotiation. The Allies demanded unconditional surrender. The war that Germany had unleashed 6 years earlier would end only with total defeat. Across Europe, German forces surrendered one by one in Italy, in Austria, in Norway. Entire divisions laid down their weapons. By the first week of May, the war that had consumed millions was breathing its last. On May 7, 1945, in a small schoolhouse in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender before the Allied commanders. The next day, on May 8, the world celebrated victory in Europe Day. Church bells rang. Crowds flooded the streets of London, Paris, and New York. For the first time in years, the guns of Europe were silent. But amid the joy, there was sorrow. Tens of millions were dead. Cities lay in ruins. Families were gone forever. And across the world, one question echoed. How had humanity fallen so far, and would it ever recover? The war was over. The Reich was dead, but its shadow would haunt the world for generations to come. The Führer was dead, but above the ashes of Berlin, the war still raged on. The final death of the Third Reich had yet to come. When word spread that Adolf Hitler was gone, silence fell over the bunker and across what remained of Nazi Germany. Some refused to believe it. Others broke down in tears, not from grief, but from the sudden realization that everything was truly over. In the days that followed, confusion ruled the collapsing empire. Joseph Goebbels, now chancellor by Hitler's will, made one final broadcast to the German people, promising that the Reich would rise again. Hours later, he and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 children, then took their own lives in the garden above. Their dream of a pure world had turned to dust. Meanwhile, Soviet forces swept through Berlin. The once mighty German capital was now an ocean of rubble. Buildings lay in heaps, streets were filled with corpses, and the stench of death lingered everywhere. For many civilians, survival became the only goal. The Reichstag, symbol of German power, was captured by Soviet troops on May 2, 1945. As the red flag was raised over its ruins, gunfire still echoed in the distance, the sound of the last defenders dying in vain. Farther west, German generals struggled to maintain order. With Hitler gone, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, based in the town of Flensburg, tried to form a new government. He hoped to negotiate a surrender to the Western Allies, fearing Soviet occupation above all. But there would be no negotiation. The Allies demanded unconditional surrender. The war that Germany had unleashed 6 years earlier would end only with total defeat. Across Europe, German forces surrendered one by one in Italy, in Austria, in Norway. Entire divisions laid down their weapons. By the first week of May, the war that had consumed millions was breathing its last. On May 7, 1945, in a small schoolhouse in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender before the Allied commanders. The next day, on May 8, the world celebrated victory in Europe Day. Church bells rang, crowds flooded the streets of London, Paris, and New York. For the first time in years, the guns of Europe were silent. But amid the joy, there was sorrow. Tens of millions were dead. Cities lay in ruins. Families were gone forever. And across the world, one question echoed. How had humanity fallen so far? And would it ever recover? The war was over. The Reich was dead. But its shadow would haunt the world for generations to come. The guns had fallen silent. But the silence was not peace. It was the sound of a broken nation breathing its last. By the summer of 1945, Germany was no longer a country. It was a graveyard. The cities that once symbolized progress and power now lay in dust and ashes. From Berlin to Dresden, from Hamburg to Cologne, not a single street was untouched by destruction. The Allied bombings had left over 3 million buildings destroyed, millions homeless, and countless more lost beneath the ruins. Trains no longer ran. Factories were empty skeletons of twisted steel. The mighty Reich, which had once promised a 1,000-year empire, had lasted barely 12 years and ended in total collapse. Amid the rubble, the survivors emerged, starving, sick, and lost. German civilians wandered through the wreckage searching for food, water, and missing loved ones. Children played among burned-out tanks, too young to understand the world they had inherited. Women, many widowed, many violated during the fall of Berlin, struggled to rebuild what little remained. The Allied armies divided Germany into 4 occupation zones: the American in the south, the British in the northwest, the French in the southwest, and the Soviet in the east. Berlin itself, though lying deep within Soviet territory, was split the same way into 4 parts. This uneasy division would later give birth to a new kind of war, the Cold War. For now, though, the Allies had a single mission: to erase the Third Reich from existence. Nazi symbols were torn down. The swastika was banned. Schools, newspapers, and radios were cleansed of propaganda. The German people were forced to confront the horror their nation had unleashed. Millions of displaced people, prisoners of war, forced laborers, and concentration camp survivors tried to find their way home. Trains carried broken souls across Europe, many with nowhere left to return to. Entire towns had vanished from the map. The Allies established denazification programs aimed at removing Nazi influence from every level of society. But for ordinary Germans, survival came first. They traded jewelry for bread, coats for potatoes, anything to see another day. Slowly, through the smoke and suffering, the first signs of life reappeared. Farmers returned to their fields. Mothers found their lost children. And amid the rubble, some dared to hope that peace might one day be possible again. Yet, deep inside the ruins, the ghosts of war still lingered in the silence of the empty streets, in the memories of what had been done, and in the faces of those who had seen too much. The Reich had fallen, but its scars would remain forever, etched into the heart of a wounded world. The Third Reich was gone, but the world it left behind would never be the same. In May 1945, when the last Nazi flags were torn down, it seemed as though evil itself had been defeated. But history, like the smoke over Berlin, lingered in the air. The war had ended, yet its wounds ran deeper than any bomb crater. Over 70 million lives had been lost. Entire generations vanished. Soldiers, civilians, children, and the innocent victims of genocide. The name Auschwitz became a scar on the soul of humanity, a reminder of how far hatred could lead. As the Allies occupied Germany, the world began to uncover the true horror of the Nazi regime. When soldiers entered the concentration camps, they found piles of bodies, rooms filled with human hair and shoes, and survivors too weak to speak. The camera lenses of 1945 captured everything and forced the world to look. At Nuremberg, a new kind of justice was born. 24 of the most powerful Nazi leaders were placed on trial for crimes against humanity. The courtroom became a symbol not just of revenge, but of responsibility. For the first time in history, the world declared, following orders is not an excuse for evil. But as Germany began to rebuild, a new conflict emerged, not of bombs, but of ideologies. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union fractured, giving rise to the Cold War. The ruins of Berlin became the front line between democracy and communism, between freedom and control. And yet, even amid this tension, something extraordinary happened. From the ashes of the Reich, a new Germany slowly rose, built not on conquest, but on peace. The children who had grown up in the ruins would rebuild their nation with humility, not pride. Across the world, the fall of the Third Reich became a warning, a lesson carved into the history of mankind, that no empire built on fear can last forever, that the truth will always outlive the lie, and that even in the darkest times, humanity can rise again. The war ended, but the story never truly does, because the memory of what happened and what was lost must never fade. The ruins of the Third Reich still stand in silence, scattered across Europe, covered in moss and memory. They whisper to every generation that comes after, remember, so it never happens again. When the fires of war died, a new world began to take shape, born not of glory, but of grief. In 1945, Europe lay shattered. Nations were broken, economies destroyed, and millions displaced. But amid the ruins, the victors gathered to shape the future of mankind. From the devastation of the Third Reich, a new world order was emerging, one that would redefine power, politics, and peace for generations to come. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, the leaders of the Allied nations Roosevelt, Churchill, Truman, and Stalin redrew the map of the world. Germany was divided. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. The Iron Curtain began to descend, a wall not yet made of bricks, but of ideology. While the guns were silent, a new kind of war had begun, the Cold War. A battle of ideas between the United States and the Soviet Union, fought not with tanks, but with fear. Across Germany, Soviet soldiers marched east of the Elbe, while American and British troops guarded the west. Berlin, once the heart of the Reich, now became the symbol of a divided world. But beyond politics, ordinary people struggled to survive. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly. Millions of refugees, Poles, Russians, Jews, and Germans alike, moved endlessly across the continent, searching for a place to belong. From this chaos rose a humanitarian effort the world had never seen before. The United Nations was born, an organization built on the ruins of the League of Nations, with one promise: never again. Yet even as peace was declared, justice was still being written. At Nuremberg, verdicts were handed down. Some of Hitler's generals faced the gallows. Others spent their lives in prison. But many Nazis vanished, blending into the shadows of post-war Europe. Meanwhile, the world faced a new horror, not born of war, but of science. In August 1945, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the Pacific conflict, but introduced humanity to a terrifying new power. The age of nuclear fear had begun. Europe's cities began to rebuild. Roads were cleared, bridges restored, and factories rose again. But no reconstruction could erase the trauma that lingered in every survivor's eyes. Out of the ashes of the Reich, mankind learned that victory comes not from destruction, but from understanding. The war had changed everything: borders, governments, faith, even the human soul. And though peace had returned, the world had stepped into a new era, one built on both hope and hesitation. The guns were silent, but Germany was no longer one nation. It had become a battlefield of ideas, a new war fought without armies. After the fall of the Third Reich, Germany was a blank page, and every Allied power wanted to write its own version of the future. What had been Hitler's empire was now carved into 4 zones of occupation: Soviet, American, British, and French. At first, it was meant to be temporary, but in truth, it marked the birth of a divided world. In the East, under the watchful eyes of Stalin, the Soviets began reshaping society. Communist leaders were installed, industries were nationalized, and strict control gripped the people. The message was clear: new Germany would rise, one loyal to Moscow. In the West, the Americans, British, and French pursued a different vision, one of democracy, free markets, and reconstruction. Through the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars flowed into war-torn Europe, Factories reopened, streets were rebuilt, and hope returned to the ruins. But this recovery came with a price: allegiance. To the Soviets, the Western aid looked like manipulation. To the West, Soviet control looked like tyranny. Between them, the line hardened, cutting through the heart of Europe. Berlin, deep inside Soviet territory, became the ultimate symbol of this divide. The city itself was split in half, east and west. Families were torn apart. Soldiers watched each other across barbed wire. It was no longer bombs that threatened the world, but ideology. The people of East Germany soon learned what liberation meant under Soviet power. Censorship ruled the press. Secret police monitored every word, and anyone who resisted disappeared in the night. Meanwhile, in the West, freedom returned, but so did guilt. The horrors of the Nazi years were not easily forgotten. Every face carried a question: how much did you know? The contrast between East and West grew sharper with every passing year. Where one side saw progress, the other saw betrayal. By 1948, the tension reached its peak. The Soviets, angered by Western reforms, blocked all access to West Berlin, hoping to starve the city into submission. But the Allies answered, not with bullets, but with courage. Through the Berlin airlift, Western pilots flew thousands of missions, dropping food, medicine, and coal to the trapped citizens below. For 11 long months, the skies over Berlin were filled with hope. In the ruins of war, the first battle of peace had been fought and won. The fall of the Third Reich had ended one war, but in its shadow, another had already begun: the Cold War. The Third Reich had fallen, but its shadow stretched across the world, dividing nations, alliances, and hearts. After the surrender of Nazi Germany, the Allies stood as victors. But victory soon gave way to suspicion. The unity that had defeated Hitler could not survive the peace. In 1946, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered a speech that changed the course of modern history. Standing in Fulton, Missouri, he declared, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. That curtain divided Europe into two worlds, one under the Soviet Union's communist control, and the other protected by Western democracy. In the East, the Soviet Red Army remained stationed in conquered lands: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany. Governments loyal to Moscow rose one by one, guided by Stalin's iron hand. The promise of liberation had turned into occupation. In the West, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, sending billions in aid to rebuild war-torn economies. It was not just about food and steel, it was about influence. The West offered prosperity, while the East offered control. Berlin, once Hitler's capital, became the symbol of this global rivalry. On one side, freedom and recovery. On the other, fear and surveillance. The city's cracked streets became the front line of a new kind of war. A war of ideas, propaganda, and power. The year 1949 changed everything. Two new nations were born from the ruins of the Reich. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, backed by the United States and its allies. In the East, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, under the control of the Soviet Union. The world was now divided into two camps. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, united Western powers. In response, the Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact. Both sides built massive armies, ready to fight a war no one wanted. But this time, the threat was far greater. The United States had the atomic bomb. The Soviets soon had their own. For the first time in history, humanity held the power to destroy itself. And as jets roared above Berlin, a silent question haunted every survivor of the Second World War. After everything we've endured, are we beginning again? The Third Reich had fallen, but its ashes had fertilized a new conflict. One not fought for land or empire, but for the soul of the world. The battle for hearts and minds had begun, and it would last for decades. From the ashes of war, Germany was reborn not as a conqueror, but as a survivor. By the late 1940s, the scars of World War II still cut deep across Europe, but nowhere were they more visible than in Germany. The once proud empire of the Third Reich was now a divided land, half ruled by freedom, half by fear. In the West, Under Allied guidance, a new spirit of democracy began to rise. The people, tired of war and propaganda, longed for normal life, for work, for family, for hope. With American aid through the Marshall Plan, West Germany started to rebuild. Factories reopened, railways were repaired. Brick by brick, a broken nation began to heal. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, Führerbunker, or West Germany, was officially born. Its capital was established in Bonn, a small and peaceful city, far from the ruins of Berlin. The new chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, promised a Germany that would never again be a threat to peace. Instead, it would stand as a pillar of democracy and unity in Europe. Meanwhile, life in the East told a different story. Behind the Soviet curtain, the German Democratic Republic (GDR) emerged, a nation built on control, censorship, and fear. Citizens were watched by the Stasi, the secret police. Freedom of speech vanished. Those who tried to flee across the border risked imprisonment or death. And yet, even in darkness, the human spirit refused to die. Across both sides, Germans worked tirelessly to rebuild homes, schools, and industries. Children grew up not knowing the war, but hearing its echoes in the stories of their parents. Each generation carried the same promise: never again. In the West, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, transformed the nation. By the 1950s, West Germany had become one of Europe's strongest economies. Cars rolled off the assembly lines in Wolfsburg. Music filled the streets of Munich and Frankfurt. Life, after years of silence, began to sing again. But the division of Germany remained a wound that refused to heal. Families were separated, letters censored, memories split between two worlds. Berlin, once the beating heart of Europe, had become a wall of ideology and pain. The Third Reich had fallen, but the German people had risen stronger, humbler, and determined to rebuild a better world. In the ruins of yesterday, Germany found its greatest victory: redemption. In a single night, a wall rose from the ground, and with it, hope on one side, despair on the other. By 1961, Germany was no longer just divided on paper, it was divided by concrete, barbed wire, and fear. For years, people had been escaping from East Germany to the West, crossing through Berlin, the only open gate between the two worlds. Doctors, engineers, students, the best minds, were fleeing communist control. The East German government, under Soviet pressure, called it a brain drain. But for the people, it was something deeper, a desperate flight for freedom. On the night of August 12, 1961, everything changed. Under the cover of darkness, soldiers and construction crews surrounded the border of West Berlin. By dawn, barbed wire fences cut through neighborhoods, parks, and streets. Families woke to find loved ones trapped on the other side. In the days that followed, the barbed wire was replaced by cement walls, watchtowers, and armed guards. Snipers stood ready to shoot anyone who tried to cross. The world watched in shock as the Berlin Wall, a scar of stone and shame, split the city in two. For those in the East, it was a prison. For those in the West, it was a symbol of freedom, and of everything the Cold War represented. Over the next 28 years, thousands would attempt to cross the wall. Some dug tunnels beneath it. Others used hot air balloons, stolen planes, or even swam through rivers under fire. Many succeeded. Many more were shot and killed, their dreams ending at the foot of the wall. The East German government called it the anti-fascist protection barrier. But everyone knew the truth. It wasn't built to keep enemies out. It was built to keep people in. Meanwhile, in the West, life flourished. Shops reopened, art thrived, and democracy stood tall. Across the wall, in the East, silence and control ruled every street. The Berlin Wall became the most powerful symbol of the Cold War, a concrete divide between two ideologies, two nations, and two human destinies. The Reich had once fallen through hate and control. Now, another kind of wall had risen, built from the same fear. Yet even as the wall stood, whispers of rebellion grew louder. People began to believe that no wall, no matter how high, could stand forever. The wall stood tall, cold, gray, and silent. But behind it, hearts still whispered one word: freedom. Through the 1960s and 70s, the Berlin Wall became more than just concrete and wire. It became a symbol of everything the Cold War stood for. In the East, life was dictated by the Soviet system: loyalty to the party, obedience to the state, and silence in the face of fear. Every street had ears. Every neighbor could be an informant for the Stasi, the East German secret police. Children grew up believing that the wall was built to protect them. But their parents knew better. They had seen the world before the wall, and they remembered what freedom felt like. Across the divide, in West Berlin, life was different. The economy boomed, art thrived, and Western ideals of democracy and capitalism shone like a beacon in the darkness. At night, lights from the western side could be seen glowing across the no-man's land, a cruel reminder of the two worlds separated by ideology. Meanwhile, the global tension between the United States and the Soviet Union reached its peak. The threat of nuclear war loomed over humanity. From Cuban Missile Crisis to Vietnam, every confrontation risked turning the Cold War hot. But amid the fear, there were moments of courage. Brave souls on both sides of the wall risked everything to cross it. Some tunneled under the ground for weeks. Some built makeshift gliders from scrap metal. Each escape was a cry for freedom, a spark against tyranny. In 1963, standing in West Berlin, President John F. Kennedy declared to a sea of cheering citizens, "Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a Berliner." His words echoed across the city, a promise that the free world had not forgotten those trapped behind the wall. Decade after decade, the wall stood, but time was changing. By the 1970s, new winds began to blow. Even within the East, people began to question their leaders. Small underground groups, writers, and church organizations started speaking quietly at first about reform, freedom, and truth. And as music, art, and hope crossed the airwaves, one truth became clear: no wall lasts forever. Behind the silence of oppression, the heartbeat of freedom never stopped. It waited patient, persistent for its moment to rise. Every empire falls not in a day, but in the quiet rebellion of hearts that refuse to bow. By the 1980s, the Berlin Wall still stood tall, but something had begun to change. The iron grip of the Soviet Union was weakening. The East German government still spoke of strength, but beneath their words, cracks were forming not in the wall of stone, but in the wall of fear. All across Eastern Europe, whispers of revolution were growing louder. In Poland, a movement called Solidarity, led by Lech Walesa, showed the world that ordinary workers could stand against communist power and win. In Hungary and Czechoslovakia, reformers began demanding freedom of speech and open elections. Even within East Germany, citizens began to question the lies they had been told for decades. They were tired of food shortages, tired of censorship, tired of living in a cage. Then came a man who would change the world's course: Mikhail Gorbachev, the new leader of the Soviet Union. He spoke of perestroika restructuring and glasnost openness. For the first time in decades, truth began to seep through the cracks of the Iron Curtain. In East Berlin, young people gathered secretly to discuss freedom. Churches became the meeting points of hope. They didn't carry weapons, they carried candles. And with every protest, every march, the fear that had held them captive began to fade. By 1987, the world was watching once again. Standing before the Brandenburg Gate, U.S. President Ronald Reagan spoke the words that would echo through history: "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Those words didn't break the wall that day, but they broke the silence. Because by then, the world knew the wall's days were numbered. Meanwhile, East German leaders tried to tighten control, but it was too late. The people were no longer afraid. Posters, songs, and underground radio spoke one truth again and again: "Wir sind das Volk." We are the people. In the factories, in the schools, and even in the barracks of the soldiers guarding the wall, doubt began to grow. The world was changing, and so was East Germany. It began as whispers, then chants, then a roar that no regime could silence. The Cold War's final chapter was being written not with bombs or bullets, but with courage. For 28 years, it stood a wall of concrete, wire, and fear. But on one extraordinary night, it crumbled. Not by force, but by the will of the people. It was November 9, 1989, an ordinary night that became one of history's greatest miracles. For weeks, the streets of East Germany had been filled with protests. Tens of thousands marched through Leipzig, Dresden, and East Berlin, chanting for freedom. The government could no longer control the tide. The world watched as cracks in the communist regimes across Eastern Europe widened. Poland was free. Hungary had opened its borders. East Germans began escaping through neighboring countries. The Berlin Wall, once a symbol of Soviet strength, now stood as a symbol of weakness. That night, a confused press conference changed everything. An East German official, Günther Schabowski, mistakenly announced that citizens could now cross freely into West Berlin, effective immediately. Within minutes, the news spread like wildfire. People poured into the streets, heading toward the checkpoints. Guards were overwhelmed, unsure what to do. At Bornholmer Strasse, the gates finally opened. No gunfire, no orders to shoot, just cheers. Loud, unstoppable cheers. The wall that had divided families, friends, and a nation was now just a line of broken stone. Men and women climbed atop the wall, waving flags and crying tears of joy. Strangers embraced. Soldiers lowered their weapons and joined the celebration. People from both East and West Berlin began chipping away pieces of the wall with hammers. Each fragment a piece of history, a piece of freedom. That night, music filled the air, the same streets that once echoed with the boots of Nazi soldiers and the silence of fear now danced with laughter and unity. The Berlin Wall, once a symbol of oppression, had fallen without a single shot fired, and as the wall crumbled, so, too, did the ghosts of the Reich buried beneath the weight of freedom. Around the world, people wept and celebrated. It wasn't just Germany's victory, it was humanity's. A generation born in shadow finally stepped into the light. By morning, news cameras captured the dawn over Berlin, a city reborn. Where the wall had stood, only dust and hope remained. The Cold War was ending, and for the first time in decades, Europe breathed as one. The wall fell that night, but what truly rose was the spirit of humanity. When the wall fell, the sound of hammers was not just breaking stone, it was rebuilding a nation. The morning after November 9, 1989, Berlin woke to a new world. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, there were no checkpoints, no walls, no armed guards, only open streets and open arms. Families long separated were finally together. Mothers hugged sons they hadn't seen since childhood. Old friends embraced at the border where soldiers once stood with rifles. In the months that followed, the impossible became inevitable. Germany was to be one again. East and West began to merge not just in geography, but in soul. But unity was not easy. The East had lived under communism for decades, its economy weak, its people weary. The West was prosperous, but cautious, unsure of how to rebuild what had been divided for so long. Yet, through all challenges, hope prevailed. Every brick of the fallen wall became a symbol of renewal. Schools, offices, and homes were rebuilt. People painted murals over the remains of the wall, messages of peace, unity, and remembrance. On October 3, 1990, under a sky filled with fireworks, the world witnessed history once more. The flags of East and West Germany came down, replaced by one. At the Reichstag building, thousands gathered as the black, red, and gold flag rose over a free, united Germany. Tears streamed down faces as the national anthem played. Einigkeit und Recht und Freiheit. Unity and justice and freedom. The same building that once echoed with the shouts of the Reich now resonated with cheers of democracy. The same streets that once marched to war now marched for peace. But even in celebration, there was reflection. Germany had been through darkness, 2 world wars, dictatorship, division. Now, its greatest task was not rebuilding walls, but rebuilding trust within itself and with the world. And so, from the ashes of the past, a new Germany was born, one built not on power, but on peace. One that remembered its sins, honored its victims, and vowed never to repeat history again. The Reich had fallen long ago, but now, Germany had truly risen, not in conquest, but in conscience. As the fireworks faded over Berlin, people sang, cried, and danced together. The ghosts of the past finally began to rest, and in that moment, the heart of Europe beat as one once more. Empires fall, flags fade, but the lessons of history, they remain. The story of the Third Reich did not end with its fall. Its shadow stretched far beyond the ruins of Berlin. It became a mirror, reflecting the dangers of hatred, blind obedience, and power without conscience. From the ashes of that darkness, the world rebuilt not just cities, but its soul. In the decades after 1945, Germany faced a truth few nations have ever dared to confront. It had been both the architect and the victim of its own destruction. Instead of denying the past, Germany chose to face it. It opened its archives, preserved its concentration camps as memorials, and taught every new generation the weight of remembrance. Children in schools learned not of glory, but of grief, so that they would never forget what happens when humanity forgets its heart. In Berlin, the Holocaust Memorial now stands a vast field of stone blocks, silent yet screaming, the memory of millions. Every visitor who walks among them is reminded, silence is not peace, and forgetting is not healing. Across the world, the scars of the Reich became lessons in vigilance. Nations formed the United Nations to guard against tyranny. The European Union rose from war's ashes, binding former enemies into partners for peace. And in Germany itself, democracy became not just a system, but a sacred promise. Today's Germany stands as proof that redemption is possible not by erasing history, but by remembering it. The nation that once unleashed destruction now shelters refugees, funds global education, and leads through dialogue, not domination. But the warning remains eternal. History does not vanish, it waits, watching, whispering. The seeds of hate can return if the soil of ignorance is left untended. The fall of the Third Reich was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of a responsibility to remember, to learn, to never repeat. Every crumbling stone of the Reichstag, every page of testimony from Auschwitz, every photograph of Berlin in ruins, they all speak one truth. The cost of hate is too high, and the value of freedom too precious. As the camera pans over modern Berlin, alive, united, free, the voice of history fades in. This is not the story of Germany alone. It is the story of us all, of what we can become, and what we must never become again. The Third Reich has fallen, but its legacy endures, as a warning, as a lesson, and as a call to our better angels. The Reich fell, but its echoes still travel through time. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world did not simply return to peace. It awoke to a haunting silence. Cities lay in ashes, families were broken, and the soul of humanity stood trembling, asking how it had allowed such darkness to rise. In the ruins of Europe, millions wandered displaced, homeless, lost. Survivors of the camps searched for names that no longer answered. Soldiers returned home, to victory, but to questions they could never forget. The war had ended, but the healing had only just begun. Across the shattered continent, the world began to rebuild brick by brick, heart by heart. Allies and enemies alike worked together to mend what hate had destroyed. The Nuremberg trials brought justice, but also a warning that evil does not always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it looks ordinary. It follows orders. It obeys without question. In the East, new powers rose. In the West, new alliances formed. The Cold War began, proof that even peace carries shadows. But amid it all, one truth endured. The human spirit cannot be conquered forever. From the rubble of the Reich emerged a new world, one that vowed to remember, to rebuild, to rise. Artists painted freedom on broken walls. Writers told stories that the dead could not. And children, born in the silence of the ruins, learned to speak words their parents had once feared to say: hope, unity, love. In time, the same Germany that had torn the world apart became its symbol of reconciliation. Holocaust survivors met with young Germans, not to curse but to teach. And through their tears, the past began to heal. Now, more than 80 years later, the lessons of that fall remain alive. Every time hate stirs, every time history is denied, The echoes of the Reich whisper again, reminding us that freedom is fragile and truth is sacred. The fall of the Third Reich was not just the end of tyranny, it was the rebirth of humanity. The camera pans across Berlin from the Reichstag dome, shining under the sky, to the Holocaust memorial, still and eternal. Children laugh nearby, their voices echoing through the stones. The sound of life after silence. Empires crumble, nations change, but memory endures, and as long as the world remembers, darkness will never win again. History is not just about the past, it's about the choices we make today. The rise and fall of the Third Reich was not just a chapter of war, it was the story of what happens when humanity forgets its humanity. From the ashes of Berlin to the silence of Auschwitz, the world learned that hate can build empires, but only love can rebuild them. Millions perished: soldiers, civilians, children, each with a name, a dream, a story cut short. They are not numbers in history books, they are the voice that whispers every time we say, never again. The ruins of the Reich are gone, its banners, its speeches, its armies, all turned to dust, but its warning remains, carved into the conscience of mankind. Because evil does not vanish with one regime, it hides, it waits, it tempts, and the only way to defeat it is to remember. In every classroom that teaches the truth, in every memorial stone laid in silence, in every generation that refuses to hate, the world keeps its promise to the fallen. Never again to tyranny, never again to genocide, never again to silence. The camera drifts slowly over Berlin at dawn, the Reichstag dome gleaming in sunlight, the Brandenburg Gate, open and free. People walking hand in hand where once there were walls. A city once divided now stands united, not by power, but by memory. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a child's laughter rises, pure, innocent, unbroken. The same sound that once vanished beneath the roar of war now echoes through a world reborn. The fall of the Third Reich is not just a story of destruction, it is the story of resurrection, of how a nation and the world found light after the longest night. As the music swells, the narrator's voice fades to a whisper. Remember their names, honor their pain, guard their lessons, because history, if forgotten, will always return. The final frame fades to black, leaving only these words: for the millions who never return, for the generations who must never forget. Text on screen: The fall of the Third Reich, a story of darkness, defeat, and the rise of humanity. And then, softly, one last line: never again. When the flames of war died, the world faced its reflection, broken, scarred, but still alive. 1945, Kibad Dunia ek ne maud par thi. 6 years of chaos had left every border redrawn, every heart heavy, and every city changed forever. But from those ashes rose a new world. The United Nations was born, an alliance not of empires, but of hopes. Nations gathered in the shadow of destruction to say, never again will the world fall to tyranny unchecked. The dream of global unity, though imperfect, began here, born from the guilt and grief of war. In Europe, the seeds of cooperation replaced the roots of conquest. Old enemies Germany, France, Britain began to trade, to talk, to trust. By the 1950s, these small beginnings would become the European Union, ensuring that Europe's strength would lie not in armies, but in understanding. In Asia, the ruins of imperialism gave birth to revolutions, democracies, and new nations seeking their identity. In the Pacific, Japan, once a partner in war, emerged as a leader in peace and technology. In the Americas, the United States and Soviet Union stood as giants, their rivalry shaping the next half century of the Cold War. But amid this global shift, one question lingered: had humanity truly learned? The Holocaust forced the world to define new words: genocide, crimes against humanity, justice. The Nuremberg trials set a precedent. Leaders would be held accountable for their crimes, no matter how powerful. It was justice born, not of revenge, but of remembrance. In every country, artists, poets, and historians began to write again, telling stories the world had tried to bury. Films, books, and documentaries emerged as a collective promise to remember. The darkness of the Reich became the light that guided moral conscience. And through it all, Germany transformed. A nation once feared became one of peace and progress. Where swastikas once flew now stands the symbol of unity, the Bundesadler. The federal eagle wings spread, not for domination, but for democracy. The Reich's fall did not end a story. It began a new chapter for the world. As the narrator's voice softens, we see modern Berlin bustling, alive, free. Children run past the Holocaust memorial, unaware of the weight beneath their feet. Proof that history's greatest victory is the ability to forget fear. The camera pans upward toward the dawn sky. A dove flies across the city white against the gray. The world rebuilt itself from its own ruin, and in that rebuilding, it found its soul again. As the 20th century ended, the ghosts of the Third Reich did not vanish with the rubble of Berlin. They remained in whispers of hatred, in symbols resurrected, in ideologies reborn under new names. History, it seems, never dies. It waits for those who forget. Across the decades, the world saw conflict after conflict, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Rwanda, in the Middle East. Every time humanity said, "Never again," the echo of war replied, "Again and again." But still, people remembered. Museums were built where camps once stood. Students walked through halls lined with photographs, faces of the innocent, frozen in time. Survivors told their stories to children who were not yet born, so that silence could never be mistaken for peace. The Holocaust memorials around the world stand not for sorrow, but for strength. Each stone, each name, is a warning carved into history. This happened, and it can happen again unless you remember. In the modern world of technology and misinformation, new battles are fought not with guns, but with lies. Hate spreads faster than ever, hidden behind screens and slogans. But so does truth. The lesson of the Reich is not just about destruction, it's about vigilance. Because tyranny does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it comes disguised as order. Sometimes it promises safety. And sometimes it starts with silence. But humanity has changed too. From the ashes of the Reich rose generations who chose empathy over hate. Artists paint peace where walls once divided. Children of those who fought now walk hand in hand across the same fields that were once soaked in blood. The European Union, the United Nations, and countless human rights groups, all born from that single promise. Never again shall the world allow darkness to reign. And so, as the film fades, we return to a quiet field where grass grows over what was once a battlefield. The wind moves softly. A child places a single flower on an unmarked grave. No flags, no speeches, no names, only remembrance. The fall of the Third Reich was not the end of history. It was the beginning of awareness. For every generation that follows, the question remains, will we remember, or will we repeat? And with that final thought, the camera rises to the horizon, sunlight breaking through the clouds. The music swells, soft and hopeful, because even after humanity's darkest night, dawn always comes. The past is never gone, it is only waiting to be remembered.